All right. Welcome back to the Southeast Asia Economies and Business Economics at the IBSN program. Today, Group 2, Emma and Teresa will do a presentation on the Southeast Asia's economic crisis in 1997 and what can we learn from the crisis. I expect other groups to ask some questions to Group 2 after their presentation. And without further ado, please welcome Group 2. Emma, Teresa, you can share your presentation file on the screen and start your presentation. Best of luck.
Okay, so then sorry for the circumstances and welcome to our presentation about the economic and financial crisis in East and Southeast Asia in 1979, answering the question, what can we learn for the future? First of all, to our agenda. First, I want to give you an overview and some basic facts about the crisis. And I will then go into more detail about the reasons or causes for the crisis. Here, the most important are the credit bubble, the lack of foreign currency hedging, and the weak regional financial market structures. Then Emma will continue with the recovery from the crisis and the policy responses in short term as well as in long term. And last but not least, the consequences and the learnings for the future. So then let's start with the general information about the crisis. The Asian financial crisis is a crisis caused by the collapse of the currency exchange rate and hot money bubble, which we will explain to you on the next slides. It started in Thailand and in July 1979 and then swept over East and Southeast Asia. The financial crisis heavily damaged currency values, stock markets, and other asset prices in many East and Southeast Asian countries. On July 1979, the Thai government ran out of foreign currency, so no longer able to support its exchange rate. The government was forced to float the Thai baht, which is the currency there, and which was pegged to the US dollar before. The currency exchange rate of the baht thus collapsed immediately. 2 weeks later, the Philippine peso and Indonesian rupiah underwent major devaluations as well. And then the crisis spread internationally and Asian stock markets plunged into their multi-year lows in August. The capital market of South Korea maintained relatively stable until October, but however, the Korean won dropped to its new low on October 28, and the stock market experienced its biggest one-day drop to that date on November 8. So the crisis, we can say that the crisis affected many countries, but in particular, Indonesia, South Korea, and Thailand were the worst hit countries. Hong Kong, Laos, Malaysia, and the Philippines were also hit by the slump, and Brunei, mainland China, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, and Vietnam were less affected, although all suffered from a loss of demand throughout the region. Although most of the governments of Asia had seemingly sound fiscal policies, the International Monetary Fund stepped in to initiate a $39 billion program to stabilize the currencies of South Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia, so the economies that were hard hit by the crisis. However, the efforts to stem a global economic crisis did little to stabilize the domestic situation in Indonesia, but later on Emma will tell you more about the situation in Indonesia. Until the crisis, Southeast Asia was an investor's paradise, so the countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea, and Thailand had shown an impressive economic performance with, for example, fast growth, low inflation, strong fiscal policies, high saving rates, or good export sectors, and also low labor costs. So these were these regions' features at that time. But then after the years of fast economic growth, the countries in Southeast Asia were facing a significant recession. This can be seen best on the chart of the GDP here. So as you can see, the economic performance fell down in 1989, especially in Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, the Philippines, and in Malaysia. So they were having a dramatically sinking GDP. Now I will go on with the causes for the crisis. So in retrospect, a number of the economic and policy failures are thought to have caused or facilitated the Asian crisis, such as excessive investment and trade deficits, excessive borrowing, including in foreign currency, and institutional deficiencies in regional financial markets. Some explanations claimed a self-inflicted crisis in tandem with a failure of international financial markets. Others placed the International Monetary Fund at the center of the criticism. But now, first of all, the credit bubble. So as a result of the liberalization of the financial sectors of Asian countries, a credit boom emerged in Asia in the 1990s. Credit volume growth during this period averaged from 8 to 10% above the GDP growth rates. Not only did the industrial overcapacity emerge, as in South Korea, but an increasingly large share of credit was used to buy stocks and real estate. The consequences were a rise in the stock markets and a sharp increase in real estate prices by up to 4 times. With rising real estate and stock prices, the Asian banks believed that they had a good collateral or security, which encouraged further lending. This capital, in turn, flowed then into stocks and real estate, and due to the resulting price increases, a speculative bubble was created in some areas. And this kind of vicious circle of lending and the increased value of collateral resulted in a strongly one-sided orientation of lending. And then at the end of 1979, the share of loans secured by real estate in Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia was between 25 and 40%. This, at the end, made banks vulnerable to price declines in the stock and real estate markets. Second cause, the lack of foreign currency hedging. Further problems resulted from different maturities and foreign currencies of the loans taken out and granted. As the banks wanted to benefit from the favorable interest rate situation on the international financial markets, debt was often denominated in US dollars or yen, that's the currency in Japan, with short maturities. Lending to domestic borrowers was mostly long-term and in domestic currency. So banks financed parts of the long-term loans with the help of money borrowed in the short term, and this led to serious differences in terms of the maturity and currency between the loans taken out and those granted. At that time, the banks relied on the stability of their respective domestic currencies and their close peg to the US dollar or the yen. With the exchange rates hedged by the states, the exchange rate risk for borrowing foreign funds seemed negligible, and foreign currency loans were comparatively cheap due to low risk premiums. The lending banks either saw no need to hedge yen or dollar-denominated liabilities against exchange rates, or, for the sake of higher profits, did not hedge risks by means of forward exchange transactions. By doing so, they benefited from the weakness of the US dollar against the yen between 1985 and 1995. So until 1995, this strategy was very successful. The Southeast Asian countries were competitive and enjoyed strong export-driven growth. But when the exchange rate of the US dollar rose against the yen, European currencies and China's currency, local currencies, suddenly rose in real terms. So this was leading to a serious deterioration in international competitiveness, lower exports, and a serious current account deficit. And now the third cause, the weak regional financial market structures. In addition to the abuses already outlined, most countries had no supervisory authorities, so banking supervision, or one that functioned inadequately. Banks did not adequately assess the credit risk and the credit worthiness of the borrowers. So also many of the banks had capital ratios that were far too low, and bank managers at that time apparently trusted that the government would support them if the difficulties should actually arise.
Okay, now I want to tell you about the recovery and policy responses. The economies were recovering strongly after some small financial crisis in Asia in the mid-1970s. This recovery didn't occur spontaneous, but was the result of consistent implementation of economic policy measures by the countries concerned and generous financial support from the international community. By the end of 1998, the strategies adopted proved successful in most cases in restoring financial market confidence and stability and in restoring economic growth. The maintenance of this recovery, as well as the sustained progress in the fight against poverty, depends to a significant extent on a lasting maintenance of macroeconomic stability and a consistent implementation of essential structural reforms. Let's start with a short-run recovery and policy responses. Policymakers have two major issues as a result of the Asian economic crisis. One goal is to find short-term economic strategies that can quickly restore growth while providing macroeconomic stability. The other one is to develop strategy that will in the long run avert future crises. External and domestic voluntary financial flows must continue in order to restore growth. External financial flows have been revived with significant effort. Large international and bilateral aid programs have been put in place in Indonesia, South Korea, Thailand to ensure investors and cover short-term financing needs. South Korea foreign exchange reserve position has dramatically improved, owing in part to an agreement to restructure external debt, but also to expand trade surpluses. Short-term debt in Thailand has not been restructured, but has instead been regularly rolled over, providing enormous cash management issues that have been effectively managed. Two challenges are whether the government should accept or guarantee the debt and how much creditor losses must be absorbed. Obtaining funding for investment initiatives is another element for recovery. Some companies in Indonesia and Thailand, for example, have had trouble obtaining bank letters of credit acknowledged, disrupting the normal flow of trade credit. To solve this issue, a number of projects have been proposed. The balance sheets of banks and borrowers must be repaired in order to resume domestic financial flows. Assets will need to be sold and financial institutions and borrowers will need to be recapitalized in order to restart normal operations. Allowing foreign investors to participate can lower the amount of government spending required to assist the financial sector's revival while also increasing efficiency. A market-based adjustment approach, on the other hand, has major challenges. The lack of effective bankruptcy rules has made it difficult to sell property in some countries. Due to a lack of transparency and poor accounting and reporting, determining the worth of the assets for sale is difficult. Corporations' financial structures can make undesirable purchases at times. Concerns about giving power to foreigners and selling assets at fire sale prices are some of the barriers to international investment. Because the costs of repair are likely to be important in several affected Asian economies, government funding will be required to help fund the repairs. In some economies, government support for the financial sector began with the assumption of bad loans and the use of central bank funds to pay out depositors of failed institutions. Now to the long run Now to the long-run recovery and policy responses. The prevention of future crises needs long-term solutions for the financial sector. While financial reform is viewed as a long-term issue, it has immediate impacts on the current situation. The absence of real banking sector changes may significantly reduce the effectiveness of large assistance packages in restoring confidence finance. The reason for this is that investors now realize that Asia is vulnerable to financial market shocks, which can result in huge financial wealth losses. Investors who have been burned by a financial crisis are now seeking guarantees that conditions have altered, making a future catastrophe less likely. They also want to be able to better analyze and manage threats that they may have overlooked previously. As a result, problems such as financial reforms and transparencies have arisen. If the big risks taken by banks were to blame for Asia's financial crisis, then a financial sector reform should emphasize that the given credit is precisely according to business requirements. The most serious issues that distressed banks in East Asia were from everyday asset quality issues and standard market risk exposures rather than highly complex transactions. The present practice of bank workouts emphasizes three elements. First, quick corrective action. Second, imposition of fines on bank managers. And third, involving regulatory authorities. Finally, it is critical to hold the appropriate supervisory authorities accountable, especially if their neglection adds to the system's costs. Next, the policies towards capital flows. The Asian financial crisis appears to be causing an anti-open capital account backlash. While the attractiveness of capital controls is clear, especially as a means of protecting weak financial systems, it is not a good foundation for a long-term solution. The core of the crisis was not capital flows, but misaligned attractions that led to excessive risk-taking and bubble financing. Institutional mechanisms exist to minimize the attractions for excessive risk-taking in these economies, which is a frequent trait. The availability of foreign finance made the banking sector's weak point in several Asian economies worse. The solution is not to impose restrictions on these flows, but to correct the attractions for risky lending through improved financial regulations and more flexible exchange rates. Capital limits are bad from this perspective because they protect weak financial sectors, generating attractions to postpone the difficult decisions, to increase bank supervision and strengthen the financial system. As a result, capital regulations improve rather than decrease the financial sector's sensitivity to future shocks. Capital controls are less effective than a high level of credibility and market-oriented policies such as price stabilization programs, increased macroeconomic stability, and institutional reforms in attracting a bigger percentage of long-term capital inflows. Now I would like to have a look at the consequences of the financial crisis. The crisis caused several million people in Southeast Asia to lose their jobs. In Indonesia, the unemployment rate doubled to just under 10%. In South Korea, it rose to around 7%. Thailand was hit particularly hard. The country had reached almost full employment before the crisis, with around 1.2 million unemployed at the end of 1997. But even larger economies were not spared. Let's have a look first at the Asian countries in general and afterwards at Indonesia. Before the start of the crisis, the tiger economies were still very successful on the global capital markets. Prior to the crisis, the tiger economies were still thriving in global capital markets, with the US dollar market accounting for around $33 billion per year. After investor confidence collapsed, Asian borrowers' value fell to barely $8 billion in 1998. The crisis was most visible in the economic performance of 1998, a year in which the GDP dropped in Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, Hong Kong, and the Philippines, after these nations have had many years of development until 1996. The world community took steps to limit the harmful implications of the Asian crisis as it got worse. Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea received $39 billion from the International Monetary Fund. Moreover, several nations and international organizations expressed an interest in assisting. There was optimism at that time that the market would soon recover. Because of its exceptional macroeconomic policies and performance, Indonesia was originally spared the worst of the currency change. It had excellent economic growth and a balanced budget and a prudent monetary policy for a time. Most critically, Indonesia began widening the rupiah's fluctuation ranges versus the US dollar as early as 1995. This allowed for a gradual decline of the rupiah, which acted as a market-based shock absorber to avoid significant exchange rate distortions from developing. The overall macroeconomic performance was remarkable as a result of these reasonable economic strategies. The country's current account deficit was not concerning because it was mostly covered by long-term investments rather than hot money. All of this helped the rupiah withstand the initial crisis by boosting investor confidence. Next, the social impact. The social impact of the crisis can be measured mainly in terms of changes in prices and assets, employment, income distribution, and poverty, education, health, social capital, and environment. As well, not all income classes were equally affected. The share of wages and salaries in total income declined, leading to changes in income distribution. Residents of rural areas who grew or raised their own food had benefited by selling their products at increasing prices, while urban households who had to buy food at increased market prices were negatively affected. So poverty increased more in urban areas than in rural areas. Cuts in government social spending reduced the availability of services as well as the quality of education, healthcare, and other public utilities. Household investment in education, nutrition, and family planning also declined.
Okay, then finally, we would like to take a look at the lessons for the future. The environmental consequences of the crisis are very complex and also numerous. Rough conclusions and generalizations must be supplemented by careful qualifications. The process of environmental improvement requires the restoration of economic stability. Environmental reforms will face a major challenge if they are not adequately supported by the government and the business community. Another lesson for the future is to build up foreign exchange reserves as a hedge against external shocks. Many Asian countries have weakened their currencies and adjusted their economic structures to run a current account surplus. So this allows them to increase their foreign exchange reserves. Finally, it is also important to weaken the relationship between the government and the capital market in the affected countries, with promoting the neoliberal model, for example, free market capitalism. It is precisely that the financial sector, that not only China, but also the countries of the Southeast Asia need to work on. I think it took years to pay off the bad loans at the end. So further, there should be no more short-term lending. This is also an important lesson from the Asian crisis. Countries in the region have also realized that they need to work more closely together. For the Asian crisis, there was no regional or no real regional cooperation in the financial sector. That is why after the crisis, countries would have very quickly formed the Asian +3 initiative, which includes the 10 countries of the Southeast Asia, plus China, Japan, and South Korea. But even more regional cooperation, stable financial markets, and greater transparency are required if Asia wants to avoid a situation like that of 1979. Yeah. Thank you. That's the end of our presentation. Feel free to ask.
Right. That was an excellent presentation. Group 2, Emma and Teresa. Right. Now let's have a discussion. Please ask some questions to Group 2. Other groups, please. Anyone?
Can you please explain what was the role of the IMF in the crisis?
Okay, so who's speaking? Paula? Is that you?
Yes, Paula.
Right. Okay, so yeah, Group 2.
I think the IMF was implementing some different programs for the different countries like Indonesia, South Korea, or Thailand that included financial assistance. But I think there were also I don't know how to say it. I think there were some rules they have to follow. So I think the IMF at the end was called to provide financial assistance to the countries. I think they provided about $39 billion in financing adjustment and reform programs in Indonesia, South Korea, and also in Thailand. And I think maybe also in Philippines. Yeah, that's it. I don't know the exact programs, but I think they helped the countries a little bit out of the crisis, maybe.
Right. Okay. Yeah, very interesting question about the role of the IMF. Right. Imagine that countries impacted by the 1997 crisis as sick people that need help from a doctor, and the doctor was the IMF. So the IMF wrote some kind of prescriptions. Hey, here's some medicine that you need to take. So yeah, the IMF suggests some points. Most of them were about restructurization programs. So here's some aspects that you need to fix. IMF came with one injection, liquidity fund, to help the country to get recovered. So to some extent, that was good, right? Because countries hit by the crisis really need liquidity funds to get recovered. But there's also some critics to the IMF. To some extent, the IMF, overly interfered the national interest, simply speaking. But we have to thank the IMF to help very quickly responded to countries hit by the crisis. But some economists once again showed their protest because of the intervention to some extent. Okay, that was a good question and response from Group 2, right? What about some other questions from you?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, who's the speaking?
Yeah, sorry for the
Julia.
Yeah, sorry for the aggressive
Julia, sorry.
music in the background. I hope it's okay.
No, it was fine.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, why did Thailand survive the crisis better than Indonesia? Can you explain that to me?
I think that's very difficult, but I would say that Thailand had maybe a stronger image in the first place, and as well a better infrastructure. and I think a more aggressive marketing. And Indonesia had lots of other problems to deal with, like political instability and social instability and stuff like that. So I would say that's the main point.
Okay, thank you.
That was good question from Gilead. Apologies for incorrect pronunciation, but yes, yes, some countries, impacted really badly in 1997's crisis. Indonesia was one of them. Yes, Thailand. It started the crisis, but it performed not really badly. Interesting case. So yes, the answer is that Indonesia, the economic foundation was not strong. It showed excellent GDP growth before the crisis, but actually the foundation was not good. GDP is a measurement of the number of products produced in Indonesia. So the contributors of the economy might be more foreign investors instead of domestic investors, right? So if that happened, then capital flight will be likely to happen. Just like, for example, all of you are making a pizza, so everyone contributes to the pizza. So whoever contribute more to the pizza will be having more rights to enjoy the pizza, right? Ethically speaking, right? So if more foreigners, I'm not saying foreign investors are bad in the economy, but if it is too excessive and not giving more opportunity to domestic investors to contribute to the economy, then what happened then, ethically speaking, foreign investors will have more rights to enjoy the pizza of the economy. So that is one of the example of why I said the economic foundation was not strong enough in Indonesia before the crisis, because excessive foreign investors contributed to the GDP, the fantastic GDP before the crisis, but then collapsed quickly. And then another indicator was that the ratio of the foreign debts to the GDP, the government, the private sectors in Indonesia before crisis, they had a relatively huge amount of foreign debt, and the government set a fixed foreign exchange rate. So before crisis, the government set $1 equals about 2,000 rupiahs, and that was fixed for many years. But then, because of the weak foundation of the economy, crisis hit Thailand and neighboring countries, and then also hit Indonesia. The government could not, hold that anymore. So the government changed the policy from fixed rate to floating rate. So market mechanism, and that quickly, changed the condition. The foreign exchange rate changed dramatically from 2,000 rupiahs to 16,000 rupiahs. And that was really bad to the economy. And then it turns into social crisis and then political crisis. So once again, why Indonesia was impacted very badly, because of the weak economic foundation. While Thailand, it had a lower GDP and economic growth in the last few years before the crisis, but it had a stronger economic foundation, lower ratio of foreign debt to their GDP, and then more domestic investors contributed to their economy, and subsidy policy. I forgot to say that Indonesia not only set a policy about fixed foreign exchange rate, but also Indonesia had been subsidizing some products, for example, oil, right? If you are in Bali, for example, you go to a petrol station or gas station, you will find a fixed price of gas or petrol. You know, it has been many years. Even in the past, the amount of subsidy was very high. The government tried to help people by subsidizing the oil price. Actually, oil price rocketed, but people in Indonesia purchased it very cheaply, and that burdened the country's national budget. So that also contributed to the weak economic foundation. When the crisis happened, we suffered a lot from the crisis, and it once again turned into social crisis. Chaotic situation happened in many provinces, including in Bali, and then people forced the former President Suharto to step down, to resign. Very interesting. Thailand was lucky, and some other countries also not really suffered from the crisis. Good question, and good response, group two. Other question? Okay, yeah, while waiting for another question, yeah, talking again about the GDP. So what do you think Indonesia and some other countries can learn from the GDP thing that we just talked about? I mean, yeah, Indonesia showed impressive GDP level, but then dropped to yeah, certain level of GDP and also economic growth, negative 13% something of the economic growth after I mean in the crisis. So what can we learn from this then regarding the GDP?
Yeah, I mean, when the GDP dropped, it was bad in general for all the countries. So it comes along with like this big unemployment rate. And I don't know what they can learn. I mean, they have to make sure that it's not gonna happen again. And I mean, they recovered pretty good, all of them. We showed it in that one slide at the beginning, or Teresa showed it, that in, I mean, the year 2000 something, they recovered pretty good. I mean, in South Korea, it was higher than before the crisis. So that's very good. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so again, GDP is a measure of, the number of products produced in the country, not by the country. GDP doesn't consider who created the pizza, like I said earlier. So if foreign investors contributed a lot more than the domestic companies or investors, then capital flight would be likely to happen. The pizza will be enjoyed more by foreign investors rather than domestic investors, and that makes sense as I explained earlier. So we need foreign investment to boost the economy, but regulations to protect the national interest is also important. Nowadays, some countries talk about deglobalization instead of globalization. Take an example, Brexit in the UK. That's an evidence of a way a country protects their national interest, right? Giving more opportunities for domestic people, domestic companies, investors to contribute more to their economy. So again, economic growth is important, GDP is important, but who contributes to the economy and how the pizza of the economy is shared to their people are also important issues. That's what we can learn from the GDP indicator. Okay, good. Good point from group 2. Any other questions, please? Okay, one more question from me. Yeah, in your presentation, you mentioned some aspects about the government, banking, and so on. So what can then the government of any country, not only in Southeast Asia in particular, what can the government, financial sectors, banking sectors, and real sectors like companies, private companies, can learn from such crisis? What do you think?
So I think maybe it's important that yeah, there is like a greater transparency or something like a cooperation between all the institutions. So maybe then you can avoid a situation like the crisis. Yeah, so that all the countries or also all the institutions are working more closely together, maybe.
Yeah, and as we already said in the last point, learning for the future, Teresa said, like more regional corporations, no more short-term lending, like all the faults they made basically at the crisis, they should avoid. So yeah.
Yeah, transparency. That's important point. The IMF encourage transparency, good corporate governance, those kind of things. The government, what can the government learn? Yeah, the government, need to keep the country's foreign debt, the level of foreign debt to the GDP at the minimum level. But that doesn't mean the country or the government should not borrow money from the IMF, for example, or whatever. So the ratio of foreign debt to GDP should be maintained at certain level, at the minimum level, that will not harm the country. So that's the point. So every country will have different ratio level. So in the crisis, as I said earlier, the foreign exchange skyrocketed. Before the crisis, imagine if you had $1 debt that was worth 2,000 rupiahs. But then because of the crisis, the foreign exchange rocketed. $1 equal 2,000 turned into $1 equal 16,000. So you have to spend more to pay your $1 debt. So that's the point. So imagine the government had to pay lots of money, because the government issued bonds in US dollars, right? So the government must pay, must spend a lot of money to pay their debt. Private companies also had, foreign debts, and they had to pay. They had to spend a lot of money, more money than they expected. So most of them collapsed because they were unable to pay their foreign debts. Managing foreign debts are very important. Okay, the government, the private sectors. For the government, subsidy policy needs to be reviewed. I mean, subsidy to some extent is needed by people, especially in emerging economy. To let people afford prices, right? but subsidizing petrol perhaps not a quite good idea. So that's why the government of Indonesia, for example, revised the subsidy policy. I mean, not all type of petrol is now being subsidized. So eventually, some type of petrol in Indonesia will be following market mechanism, just like in developed countries. So prices will be changing, every day, right? Just like in your country, for example, because one day we cannot rely on the subsidy, because that will be very harmful to the country. In the banking sector, yeah, banks need to manage their non-performing loan at the very minimum level by, prudent mechanism, carefully, providing loans to people or to companies. That is because, a high level of non-performing loan or NPL will certainly harm the bank's health and can lead to a bankruptcy, just like what happened in Indonesia. Hundreds of banks almost collapsed, and then some banks were merged, some banks were just collapsed and liquidated, right? So banks need to be careful in providing loans to their debtors. Companies should use more domestic resources, right? Instead of getting resources from foreign countries, especially when they sell their products in domestic market. Imagine if you are selling a product in Indonesia in rupiah, you will receive money in rupiah when you sell your products, but you import things that you need for the production from the US, for example, or Germany, for example. So you will have to pay your liabilities in the US dollars or euro, right? So when dollar or euro gets stronger than rupiah, you have to spend more money, and that would be harmful to your business, right? Yeah. So yeah, I think that's all. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Oh, good, great. Yes, please.
But not to the presentation. Did you note our attendance?
I think for attendance, I just need to take your pictures. So later on, after we finish this section, I will ask you to turn on your camera and then take a picture, and then I will report that to the IABS. And I think are they also join this meeting?
Okay,
Right?
thank you.
Great. Any questions regarding Group 2's presentation? No? Great. Okay. If there's no more question, I thank everyone here. Group 2, you did well. I really appreciate your effort. All of you, thank you so much for your attention, for your enthusiasm in joining this online meeting. So have a nice holiday then. Take care and see you again after the semester break. Bye now. Take care.
Bye.